Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 6, Lesson 4, Data Tables. In the last lesson, we learned about structs in Unreal Engine, and we set up one for our loot struct. Now I'd like to set up a loot table, and for that, we're going to use a data table. So the objectives of this lesson are to define data tables. We'll explain common uses of data tables. We'll demonstrate creation of a data table in Unreal Engine, and then we'll demonstrate using a data table to extract information. And per the Unreal Engine documentation, data tables, as the name implies, is a table of miscellaneous but related data grouped in a meaningful and useful way, where the data fields can be any valid UObject property, including asset references. A data table is a matrix of rows and columns, and a row is the instance of a struct, and the column is the variable type when pulled from that struct. There's also one other type of data table, which is a data curve, which is similar to a data table, but it only supports floating point variables. These can also be useful when you want a struct that only contains floats. So if you were to think of a data table as an Excel spreadsheet or another matrix type list of information, you can see that there's many uses for this when it comes to game development. They're especially useful in data-driven projects where complex systems are used to track progression and balancing. They can also be used as a container for large loot tables, which is one of the things we're going to use it for in our project. But they can also be used as a container for attribute and stat systems. And one benefit is they can be imported and exported into Unreal Engine as a CSV or JSON file type. So this means that you could create the data table in Excel or another matrix-based program, export it as a CSV file, and then import it into Unreal Engine. Additionally, you can use it as a JSON file, which can be used by various other programs to process the data. So let's start by demonstrating the creation of a data table in Unreal Engine. Here I am back in our project, and I am in the blueprints folder and then loot, which is where we have our loot struct and the two loot types that we've already set up. If I right click and then go to miscellaneous, you'll see that one of the options is data table. We can also see the curve table, which we talked about, but we're going to use data table here. So let's click this, and the first thing it's going to ask us is to pick a structure for a data table. Now, as I said, these are based upon a struct, so we need to have a struct created before we can create the data table. Let's go ahead and drop this down and pick our loot struct, and then we'll select OK. I'm going to call this DT for data table, and then we're going to call this loot table. And let's open that up. And here we can see our data table, and what we can do is we can do add to add a new row. Now I'm just going to expand these a little bit so we can see what they are, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it's done. So it's created a row in our table, which remember is an instance of a struct. We cannot change this number, but we can change the row name by double clicking. If you wanted to create some type of serialization system for your loot, you could do that here. We created a loot name. We could actually delete that from our struct and use this row name in its place. So for instance, our first one could be called currency. And if we delete that here, now that's gone from our loot table, and we'll just use the row name instead. The loot class we can set to currency. Now, if we add additional variables to our struct, for instance, let's just add a couple random ones, even if we're not going to use them. We'll add a Boolean and an integer. Then here we could set those in our data table for each row. So let's add a few more rows, and we can see now that it's starting to look more like a matrix-based program, like Excel or something similar. And we can set these classes for each of our instances, as well as the variables. So for instance, we use the example of having a trade-in value If you were doing some type of RPG where there were vendors that you could trade your loot into, you might need something like this. Additionally, you may have an inventory system where items can be stacked instead of taking up their own space in the inventory. So you can type something like is stackable. And then you could set that for each loot type. So as you may be able to see now, this is a very valuable resource when we want to keep track of lots of information. And because it could be imported and exported from Excel, you could create these large loot tables in an external program and then import them all at once into your game. For our game though, our loot is going to be pretty basic. So I'm just going to create a few variables. I want to keep my loot class because we're going to use that to spawn various loot types. I'll delete these other two variables and I want to create a loot description. So I'm going to type loot description. And this is going to be a string. And I'm also going to create a loot image, which will be a texture 2D. So the last thing I want to demonstrate is how to use a data table to extract information. And for this, in my loot table, I'm just going to create a couple rows. And this is just going to be for testing for now, but eventually we're going to set this up to hold the various loot types that we can gather in our game. And the loot types are going to be different weapon types. So I'm just going to make up a couple different weapon types. The first one will be a laser cannon, and the next one is going to be a missile launcher. And let's just create two new children of BP loot called BP laser cannon and BP missile launcher. And here in our data table, we can set those loot classes. So for our laser cannon row, we can set the loot class to BP laser cannon. We can type a description. And if you had an image, you could set that. For our missile launcher, let's select BP missile launcher. And there we have it. We have our loot table that has 3 possible loot types that we could gather. And if you remember, in our enemy base, we have it set up so that when we destroy an enemy, it spawns a currency. What we could actually do is have this spawn a random currency. So I want to create a new function. And it's going to be called getRandomLoot. And if we drag off here and we type table, you'll notice we have a couple different functions that we can use. Get data table column as a string, and then get data table row names. Let's use get data table row names. And for the input, it's asking us for a table, and we can choose our DT loot table. And then notice the output of this is an array. If we drag off here and type for each, we can cycle through each row in the table. And then from here, if we type table again, and then scroll to the bottom, you'll see get data table row. And when we select DT loot table for our data table, you'll notice that the output of this is our loot struct. But what we want to do is we want to get a random value from this loot table. So what I can do is create a random variable by saying random int in range. And here I can get the total length and drag that into here. So what this will do is get a random integer between 0 and the length of this, and it will select a random number. Then we can do a check that the index of our loop is equal to that random number. And if it is, we'll get the row name from that loot table and have access to the struct. And what we could do is we could set this to a local variable called loot class, and then have a return node that passes that random loot class that we found as an output of this function. And we can make this a pure function. And then now where we're spawning actor, we can say get random loot and drag that into here. And it will now, instead of just spawning currency, it'll get something random from the loot table. Now, just to show that this is working, I want to set up some visualization for the two new classes that we created, missile launcher and cannon. So in missile launcher, let's just add a static mesh, and we'll create a cube, and we'll make the missile launcher red, and the laser cannon will do the same, add a static mesh, but for this one, we'll make it yellow. And there we can see that we actually spawned one of our other classes. And if we were to continue to experiment with this, we would see that we're getting randomness. One problem though is you'll notice that sometimes it's not spawning anything. And the reason for that is that we're getting the length, which will be the total number of indexes in our array. But this is actually going to be one too many because 0 is not counted in that. So to fix this, we'll just do a subtract and -1. Now we have a loot system that will randomly spawn some loot whenever we destroy an enemy, and it's going to spawn that from the loot table that we created. Now for your game, you may want to change this functionality slightly. Feel free to make your own edits to it. For instance, in my game, maybe I don't want weapons to spawn as much as just regular currency, so you could create some type of weighting system that only spawns a weapon maybe 10% of the time or 5% of the time, and then you could adjust that frequency. Feel free to experiment around a little bit with this and get it to do what you would like it to do for your game. But right now we're spawning these other weapons that we made, which is missile launcher and laser cannon, but they don't actually do anything yet. For my game, what I'd like is that when the player picks these up, they actually gain access to additional weapons. And we will handle this in the next lesson.